Maker's marks are a wonderful little piece of history. Tell us who made the plane. From that, we can often deduce when it was made as well. Usually located on the toe of the plane. They are often very simple, like this Ohio Tool Company mark. They can also be complex at times, like this very rare Israel white mark. A lot of times it'll have the location of the maker on it as well. Sometimes, not always. So there's a difference between the maker's mark and then an owner's stamp. So you can see this on this plane, a Boston maker, and then C.W. Page is the owner. Owner's marks were usually a very different style than the maker's mark. So a lot of times they can be easy to differentiate between the two. Planes can have many owner stamps on it. Here's one with a, let's see, this is a British plane, and you've got Tinker, small, and then the opposite direction, LWS, are all the owner stamps on it. But in this case, pretty easy to tell the difference between the two. And remember that, you know, who made the plane is not the same as who made the iron. Outside of some of the major plane makers we'll talk about today, most plane makers didn't make their own irons. So here we have example, John Vate, Philadelphia, tells you the street corner his shop was on. But the iron that came with this is a W. Butcher iron, and that's true. That's going to be true for most of the planes you find out there. The iron was, the body of the plane was meant to outlast the iron. Over the lifetime of the plane, you'd go through, I don't know how many irons, but if you're sharpening them daily, they will wear out much quicker than the body of the plane. And so the iron that came with the plane is usually not the one that it was first purchased with, and alongside that, it was probably not made by that plane maker anyways. So let's start off with the major, one of the biggest plane makers, Sandusky Tool Company, incorporated in 1869 in Sandusky, Ohio. This was one of the biggest, like I said, names out there. Here's a really cool picture of the company's employees, or some of the company's employees, that were taken about, I've seen a couple dates on this photo, so 1870, 1880s, pretty close to after they were incorporated. If your plane was from that era, one of these guys may have made it. Here's some of the marks used by the company over time. The top couple are the most common. So I don't know what their production was like. I do know that OhioMemory.org says that by the 1880s, Sandusky had approximately 200 employees. So they weren't just making planes, they were also making hoes, axes, other tools. But we can imagine that their output was in the tens of thousands of planes every year. The book Lost Sandusky says that by 1905, Sandusky was making 2/3 of the plane irons produced in the US. So that gives you kind of an idea of how big they were. 1924, they were hit by a tornado. Here's the photo of that. It's obviously pretty devastating. The company was already on its way out by then. The corporate secretary wrote a book a couple years later, a history of the company, and in it he wrote that we soon came face to face with the grim fact that we were manufacturing a fine line of carriages, buggy whips, fly nets, harnesses, and sleigh bells in an automotive age. bought out by American Fork and Hoe in 1926 and went under a couple years after that. Something worth pointing out here is that, a little side note, that they had a house brand starting in either the 1870s or 1880s, I'm not sure exactly which, called Augants, and you'll see those out there, the Augants brand, and if you see it, you just know that there's just it's another Sandusky tool company plane. Moving on to the Ohio Tool Company, one of the other major names. Here's that plane again. They may have been in business as early as 1823, but they were formally incorporated in Columbus, Ohio, 1851. At that point in time, it had about 200 employees. An interesting note about them is that they used prison labor from the 40s through 1880. They weren't the only plane maker to do that, and several of the other plane makers also used prison labor through the 1800s. By 1887, here's some of their marks. By 1887, they were down to 70 employees, so big change over 30 years. In 1893, they merged with the Auburn Tool Company, also sometimes known as the New York Tool Works. Auburn Tool was another major plane maker, and when they merged with Ohio shut down Auburn's plane making production, and after that Auburn just made irons, and their irons are very common. You'll see their Thistle brand irons out there a lot. They also started at the same time, 1893, a secondary line of planes under the Scioto Works brand. These planes had the same iron as their premium line, but the wood used in the plane was a lower grade. And they are super common, and the Scioto brand is super common. I have a theory, I don't know if it's right or not, but I think because they were cheaper, they were bought by people who are not full-time woodworkers. So weekend warriors, weekend carpenters, people who thought you just needed to own a bench plane just because it was some of the tools you needed to have around the house. And because of that, these just sat in garages and they sat in barns and were never used. And that's why we see a ton of them today. I don't know, just a theory. A flood took out the factory in 1913. They rebuilt in West Virginia and went out of business in 1920. According to their 1910 catalogs, they were still actively making wooden planes still around 1910. Next up is Herman Chapin and his Union Factory brand. He was making these planes he was using this mark in between 1826 and 1851. They were near New Hartford, Connecticut. Really common mark. Also, another really common mark is just his name, H. Chapin. Over the years after he died in the 60s, his sons took over the factory and or the business and used a couple different names, H. Chapin and Sons, and some variants. By 1870, they had 28 employees and were making 40,000 planes a year. So when we talk about having 200 employees, like Ohio and Sandusky had, you can kind of get an idea of how many planes the bigger companies must have been making. But yeah, the most common variant of this is the Union Chapin or the Union Factory mark. as well as this single H. Chapin. Last up on our tour is Greenfield Tool Company, 1851 to 1883 in Greenfield, Massachusetts. They had at their peak 60 to 70 employees and were making 10 to 12,000 planes a month. I don't know much more about them. I don't see a lot of Greenfield bench planes, you know, joiners, jacks, smoothing planes. I mainly see plow planes, rabbits, sash planes. This is a sash plane right here. I don't know if that's indicative of what they produced or if that's just what's lasted. So yeah, interesting little note about them. Here's some of their marks. All of them pretty similar. So those are the major ones I wanted to touch on. Almost all the information that I have today came from this incredible book called A Guide to the Makers of American Wooden Planes. It's where I got a lot of those marks that I showed. Really an incredible book. Catalogs, I'm pretty sure, around 4,000 different plane manufacturers in the US in the 17, 18, and early 1900s. Super recommend this to anybody who's interested in wooden planes. Really an invaluable resource, and also just really fun to look through. If you have a maker's mark that you want to know more about, let me know in the comments. I'll try to find out more about them for you. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.